And now we have a session with two Asia 21 Young Leader alum, speaker Henry Motte-Muñoz and moderator Karen Tay. Their session is on the education to employment gap in Southeast Asia. After this 45-minute session, we're going to have a short coffee break. But for now, please welcome our moderator, Karen Tay.
Thanks, Margaret. Hi, everyone. I'm Karen, and I want to introduce you to our wonderful speaker here, Henry. Henry is a pioneer in the Philippine edtech space. He founded Edukasyon with the goal of improving the education to employment outcomes for millions of young Filipinos. Over the last 5 years, he has built a platform with access to schools, scholarships, online courses, and other learning resources that empower the youth to make better informed decisions about their education, career, and life, visited by more than 10 million students each year. So Henry graduated from the London School of Economics and Harvard Business School, and this is not his first startup. Previously he was a senior associate at Bain Capital. Anyway, I have spoken to Henry before. He's really inspirational, so I want to make sure we have as much time to ask him questions about what he's learned about learning, career decisions, the Asian population. And before we go into that, I think he has a short presentation on what his company does. Henry, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. So first of all, thank you so much, Asia Society for having us today to share a little bit some of our findings about the education employment gap in Southeast Asia. It's a problem that we've been thinking about a lot and working on for many years, and I think COVID has probably heightened awareness of the shortcomings of the education system in different parts of Southeast Asia. And specifically today, I will be talking a lot more about the Philippines because that's the market we operate in and we know better. But unfortunately, a lot of the issues you see in the Philippines are replicated in other countries like Indonesia. So I'll take you very quickly through the presentation. I think it's a lot more interesting to kind of go through the Q&A with Karen. So if you go to the next slide. So we have a very simple philosophy. Every Filipino student, is capable and is in fact worthy of a successful and fulfilling future, which obviously can sound a bit aspirational, but when you understand the education development funnel in the Philippines, you'll realize that this is unfortunately a distant dream for the majority of students. If you go to the next slide, you will see that we think that for students to do well, you have to do a mix of, focusing obviously on the academic education, but also providing them with a lot of support in terms of, advice and mentorship, supplementing it with, some lifelong learning, and then obviously making sure that they know what the career opportunities are for them. And if you think about where Edukasyon.ph as a platform plays, we're really mostly in the support bubble. I think we don't try to provide our own, college degrees or our own senior high school degrees. We're really about connecting students to existing opportunities that are in the country. And so if you go to the following slide, this is the funnel that I can talk about for hours. It's a pretty depressing funnel. But the way to think about it is every year, 2 million students turn 18 in the Philippines. You lose about 300,000 who don't get to graduate high school, even though high school is free. Public high school is free. Less than half enter higher education, which we're just calling college to make it simple, but we include tech block there. That's actually a pretty high number considering the Philippines is a low-income country. But then of those who enter, a majority don't even graduate. And then of those who graduate, only half find a job. And so if you turn 18 in the Philippines today, and these stats were pre-COVID, when the country was growing at 6-7% per year in terms of GDP, you had a roughly 10 to 15% chance of jumping through all the hoops. Now, this doesn't mean that 1.8 million students become jobless forever. They eventually find their way into the employment space, but youth unemployment is very high. And more importantly, students don't get to realize the career aspirations that they had, and they don't get to have the income that they should be getting at graduation. So this is the broken funnel that we've been focused on for the last, 6+ years, and which will keep us busy for the next 60 probably. if you go to, the following slide, I think this is not news to anyone here, but the current situation has made things even more difficult. The Philippines, like many emerging markets, suffers from a digital divide. And so not only was the quality of education already different between wealthier students who go to private school and students who go to public school, but now access to internet, to a reliable infrastructure, and to the right gadgets means that even some students in private schools are not even getting their full quality education because they don't have the right infrastructure for it. And so the situation has gotten much worse. And that's motivated us even more to try to come up with solutions to help bridge that gap. And yes, I think that's already been mentioned. So we are the largest edtech platform in the Philippines, and in some ways, though, we think we're still at the beginning of our journey in terms of what we can do to help the students. So thank you for listening to this little introduction, and I would love to just jump into some Q&A with Karen.
Yeah, thanks so much, Henry. I always like to start with your story. What made you so passionate about this topic, right? I mean, the data is there, but often there's a personal interest that comes from somewhere. Can you tell us more about how you decided to start this?
Sure. So, my background was a bit more classical, I would say. So I'm half French, half Filipino, by the way, in case you're wondering the link to the Philippines. And so I grew up between Europe and the Philippines and always had a very strong personal attachment. And I have a lot of relatives who do a lot of social work, who've done anything from, gender equality to technical vocational training to fighting corruption. So I've kind of been bathed in that atmosphere from a pretty young age. But I initially worked in finance, so did a couple of years of finance in the UK. And then when I was doing my MBA in the States, I was very lucky and I was given a grant by the Harvard Business School Social Enterprise Institute. And I was able to spend a summer in the Philippines, try to set up an anti-corruption NGO. That was not necessarily a success, but it was a great experience. And I don't come from a family of educators. There are no teachers, there are no professors in my family. But I was always steeped in this idea of social justice. And so when I was looking around trying to work on this anti-corruption NGO, I kept trying to understand the roots of all the different issues facing the Philippines from a development perspective. And all the roads kept leading back to education. And I think that just kept resonating with me. And when I look at my family background, I was a scholar, my sister was a scholar, my parents were scholars. My grandfather was a subsistence farmer who finished public high school at 14. But my grandmother was highly educated. And, I've always heard about the importance of education. And I've seen firsthand how education can basically just change your trajectory. And so I think if you're asking about the personal story, it's really been around what I've seen from my family and from, I want to give the same opportunities that I was lucky to get growing up.
So within a few generations, your family, you have personally seen that mobility in your family, right? From your grandparents.
Yes, it's really a mix of luck as well. Being given those opportunities, I don't think we were more worthy than others of getting scholarships, but very often it was about getting the right advice and choosing the right course, understanding the career consequences of a certain course. And so that's the genesis of Edukasyon. We don't want to give students more homework. We don't want to give them more topics. We want to give them more advice.
And I just want to double click on some of the things you mentioned earlier. One of them was this idea of mismatch, right? Like you have 200, what was it? 2 million per year, and then only 200,000 get a job. That's like a 90% attrition rate. And then you had a little figure there which said that, and then 1 million jobs are not filled, right? So this labor mismatch is something that we see everywhere, especially with digitalization. Even so, I'm from Singapore, as you know, and we also have a major shortage of tech talent, right? We have this big shortage because the sector has just changed so fast. So many jobs in so little time, the education system couldn't catch up. Can you talk a little bit more about the flavor of this mismatch in Philippines, compared to this general, tech talent shortage worldwide? What is happening here? What's specific there that's happening?
Absolutely. So I think what's interesting is, to your point, when you talk about labor shortage, you often think about cutting edge industries. And in the Philippines, there is also a digital shortage, right? And even us as a startup, we have a hard time hiring because the digital talent is a very high demand. And every time you make a job offer, the applicant has 10 others. but it actually runs a lot deeper than that. I think if you look at the statistics, if you speak to the CEOs in the Philippines of all the different private companies, there are shortages not just in tech and digital jobs. There's shortages in engineers. There's shortages in carpenters. There's shortages in massage therapists. So there's a lot of callings and pathways that don't necessarily require a 4 or 6 year degree. There's a lot of jobs in the Philippines that could be filled with technical vocational education. But the problem that we see is that, firstly, there's a college first mentality. So parents absolutely want their kids to go to college because that's the best thing for my child. And so, tech voc is for people who have either less income or whose kids are not as smart. And so you basically, you don't have enough people going into tech voc. And then second of all, there's a lot of there's just very little knowledge about what are the job market dynamics. And so middle income parents will often tell their kids to go into, teaching or nursing. Higher income groups will push for law or medicine. And, there's a lot of professions in the Philippines where we have too many graduates. I think at one point we were graduating 150,000 nurses too many a year. Because the mentality was like, oh, it's a safe choice. So every child and their cousin was told to go into nursing. And so this is where the mismatch happens.
That's a really interesting trend, actually, and we spoke previously about how like family and culture really shapes the decision making to an extent that's perhaps larger than other parts of the world. Can you speak a little bit about what you've noticed here, with regards to the culture that you operate in?
Yes, so the Philippines is a very odd culture, right? We're almost the Latin American country of Asia. It's 300 years of Spanish occupation, 50 years of American colonization, and so you get this hybrid Latin North American culture, but still within an Asian context. But what you find is, family structure is very tight. Students will live at home until they get married, regardless of their income class. And so there's a deference to parents, and there's a deference to elders that's, very, very deeply ingrained. And I think whilst this is maybe seen in some other cultures, the extent to which a student in the Philippines is part of a family unit, when a student starts working in their first job, they don't just live at home, they give part of their income to the family, and it just feeds into the family budget. So essentially, a child's education choice and career choice is not an individual choice, it's a family choice. And it's not just because the parent is paying, it's because the parents and the siblings will benefit from the child doing well. And so obviously, I think in very higher income families, that's less of a consideration, but the parents are still playing a big role. But middle class and below, it's very much a shared income mentality. And so as a result, the parents play a very large role in deciding what their children should study.
That's interesting. Maybe you can talk about how, what you've noticed has shaped how you've built your product, because you say you want to guide students better, but actually parents are a big part of this, right? So
Yes.
how has this user insight shaped your product and your business?
Well, so I think, ironically, we try to bypass that relationship a little bit at the beginning. Because what we found was, because the Philippines was not as digitally advanced, the students were all online, but often their parents were not. And so we found that actually, if you were trying to target the parents, it was quite hard. This was back in 2015, 2016. And so instead, we basically created content that was very much directed to Gen Z students and was all around, helping them with their self-awareness, helping them figure out their areas of interest, helping them understand their options. But because our content is, it's a bit fun, but it's still quite serious. This is education after all. It's parent friendly, but it's targeted to students. So students felt like they had a safe space and could explore. And that's how we grew our traffic organically from 100,000 students in 2016 to about 8 million students and 2 million young adults a year. I think what we're finding now, though, is we've probably reached our limits as a platform in terms of direct conversation with students. And so we're actually adding a much stronger parent element over the coming months. But we're only doing that because we've already built a relationship with the students themselves.
can you recap some of the stats here? Like how many students on your platform? What is your business model? How does it work?
Yes, absolutely. So there's, I would say that in education, there's two ways of monetizing. You either offer free content and free services to students, and you get institutions that pay in the background, or you charge directly to students, i.e., their parents. Initially our approach was to make sure the platform was completely free. It was very important for us to reach as many students as possible. We're a for-profit investor-backed startup, but we're very much also a social enterprise. And so our goal was reach as many students as possible. And so all the services you see on Edukasyon are free. Whether it's a search engine, whether it's, I think we have our student magazine has about 2,500 articles. We have hundreds of videos of content, etc. All of that is free. And it's been paid for by everyone from Unilever to Amazon to the Asian Development Bank. So all these institutions basically pay to co-create educational content or features with us, and the students get to use it for free. And that's been our primary business model for the last 5 years. I think what we're starting to venture into now is actually add-on premium services for students, which the parents can pay for. But that we haven't launched yet. That's going to be coming online later this year.
Okay, really interesting. All right, I know there are many teachers and educators in the audience, and please type your questions in the Q&A for Henry, and I will post them to him. But I think let's pivot a little bit because you mentioned that Philippines has had the longest lockdown, and there have been a host
Yes.
of consequences there. Schools have been shut down for maybe one of the longest in the world.
Yep.
Everything has had to go online. On one hand, Philip, the younger generation is quite comfortable digitally, but you said you've noticed certain things about inequality. You've noticed things about how people learn. Give us an overview of what has happened there.
Sure. So I think I'll be candid. It's a very ugly picture, and there's actually a lot of resentment within the education community, which frankly, like we share a little bit too, with how the government has handled the situation in terms of we understand the need for safety,
Mhm.
but it's been taken to such an extreme level that for schools to not have reopened since March 2020, um, even in areas where transmission risk have fallen, et cetera, et cetera. The toll on students' mental health
Yep.
has been unprecedented.
Mhm.
And I think what we're seeing is initially I think there was almost like a silver lining because the education sector in the Philippines was frankly quite traditional, and
Yeah.
COVID just forced a lot of digitization of processes, forced schools to start learning how to teach online. And so the proportion of students who were learning online pre-COVID was, I think, 0.1 or 0.2% had ever tried online learning. Within a couple of months of COVID, that had jumped to about 25 or 30%. And that's fantastic for those 25 or 30%. For the other 70 or 75%, they've actually receded to printed modules and radio shows, which, it's better than nothing, but you're really creating a two-tier society between people who get the online experience and students who don't. And
Yeah.
even within those who get the online experience, you have those who have a very good internet connection,
Yeah.
and they get an even higher quality experience. And then there's those who get supposedly an online education, but it's broken Zooms in a crowded kitchen around 5 family members.
Yeah.
I think in terms of the biggest issues we've seen, it's that the mental health issues have absolutely ballooned, and the motivation levels have dropped massively. And there's surveys that show this from a nationwide level. We see it in our own data as Edukasyon, because historically every year 20 to 30% more students were using the site, and we knew exactly which month they'd use it. People plan for college at around the same time. People start asking questions at the same time, etc. And it's been a roller coaster. The data has been completely erratic since the lockdown. And so there's literally weeks where students are just so deflated that they're just not planning for anything. And we've had a lot of anecdotal evidence by working with the Philippines is a very religious country, and so we have there's a lot of youth groups organized around religion, and some of the most, type A, overmotivated students who would have been, running youth camps before are now incredibly despondent. And so you're seeing a massive motivation issue. And so the way we're looking at the education system now, and even at our role as Edukasyon.ph, is increasingly almost as like a motivating coach rather than a tutor, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
There's no point trying to explain math concepts if the student is just completely demotivated and anxious.
Yeah. Yeah. So how does that change the way that you deliver your content and have thought about the services you provide? Can you double click on that for us?
Yes. So we've just spent a lot more time with guidance counselors and therapists and mental health organizations than we ever thought we would. Because I think the more we talk to students, the more we realize that, many of them have been stuck in this place of high anxiety. And to be fair, I don't blame them. I mean, you have, the Philippines has not handled COVID very well in general. So you, as a student, you fear a lot for your family's safety. And then on top of that, the students have been locked up, basically at home for 18 months.
Yeah.
And so that's just a recipe for disaster. So a lot of our work has been around, helping students find their motivation again, helping students process what's going on. Because even for us, like, we can't really talk to you about planning for college if you don't even want to, if you have no motivation to go to school tomorrow.
Yeah. Can you give some examples of, because we have educators in the audience and administrators, right? Like
Right.
how do you think about motivating students and delivering this content to them? Anything that you've learned that works?
Sure. So it's very important to go back to the why.
Yeah.
And for basically to, it's almost like a spiritual retreat, right? But like you don't talk, at least what we found was helpful for us was we kind of put aside like subjects and grades and entrance requirements, and even like income that you'll get from a certain career path. But it's literally trying to discuss why do people even study? What is the point of studying? What will you gain from it, and how will this make you a better version of yourself? How will this make you a truer version of yourself? How do you find your inner North Star? And all of these can sound a little bit woozy, but it's very, very important to have those conversations with the students. And we found that when we talk about this, that's when we get much higher engagement on social media. We've run seminars around this, and the students get engaged.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point because, when you're not motivated, like just saying, oh, pass this, pass that, get that qualification, you're just like, I don't even feel like opening my email, getting out of bed, right? So why should I
Correct. Yeah.
do it? So like
Yeah.
that
And
motivation.
it's tough. We really feel, because like it's almost like the workload of the teachers has tripled. They now have to become essentially IT experts who can manage a class remotely. And on
Yeah.
top of that, on top of being an educator, they have to become an IT expert, and then now they have to become kind of like a class therapist.
Yeah.
It's a lot of pressure on the education system.
Yeah.
And so that's why we keep thinking of how can we build features or content that makes the lives of teachers a bit easier when it comes to motivating students or giving them guidance.
Right, right. Yeah, we have some questions coming in, but I want to just ask you one more thing on this note, which is, have you any positive examples of partnerships that have arisen to address this new landscape, the COVID thing, which has three impacts, as you mentioned? The first one is this motivation, mental health. The second one is the bifurcation and inequality. And the third one, which you didn't mention today, but you mentioned the last time we spoke, was about, this generation viewing education as much more like entertainment, right? So how do you, what are the partnerships you've seen that have worked for the benefit of our educators here?
Sure. So the first partnerships that we found quite helpful were working with the telecom companies in the Philippines, the internet providers, because we just realized that, look, if bandwidth is the first issue, well, let's go to the root of the problem. Let's talk to the two companies. There's two dominant internet players in the Philippines. Let's talk to them and making sure that students will not get impeded in their access to free guidance from Edukasyon. And so there was one partnership that really helped us. We worked with both Globe and Smart, and they basically, I think, gave like extra gigabytes of data for students to be able to use our sites for free. So I think one, partnering with the telcos has helped, especially as they're the ones who are basically increasing internet penetration in the country. The second type of partnership that we found was quite helpful was with a lot of corporates. If you think about, corporates are always looking to engage with students, and the argument that we've been making to corporates has been, look, like, sure, you can run ads that are funny, you can run ads with celebrities, you could also co-sponsor like quality educational content that's actually useful, and your brand gets associated with something useful as opposed to something funny. And so that's how we did work with Unilever. We did work with, Gatorade. With a bunch of different brands that are typically very consumer focused. And the idea is not to sell shampoo or sell soft drinks to kids, but the idea is to essentially teach specific modules, whether it's about confidence, whether it's about self-awareness, whether it's about breaking gender stereotypes. And that's been very motivational for the students. And the third one has been to really partner with experts. So, we work with CDAP, which is the Career Development Association of the Philippines. And, they've been working on career guidance before I was born, and probably before my mother was born. So, they've been around for a while. And I think getting those kind of experts in is very, very important, because tech is lovely, but at the end of the day, expert content is incredibly valuable, and probably the most valuable thing for a student. I want to touch base a little bit on the entertainment that you mentioned. It's a bit tough. At the end of the day, if you're trying to educate and empower students, it's a serious topic, but they're used to consuming so much entertainment that if you're not a little bit entertaining, it's going to be a very tough conversation. So we've experimented with different formats. We find that live streams go down quite well, especially if you have a very engaging host or moderator, or tutor or teacher. So that's one. The second thing is around good old rewards. So we've set up something called Quest, where basically if you complete a bunch of different tasks, which includes like comparing school options or reading articles or taking quizzes, you earn coins, and the coins can give you rewards. And so, is this the way I would want people to get engaged? Not necessarily, but can it work in motivating students to spend more time figuring out their future? Yes.
Yeah.
It's a mix of content. It's a mix of rewards. You don't want to make it too consumer based though, because at the end of the day, like you do need to appeal to this desire to better yourself.
For sure. I really hear that tension. I want to move on to the questions because we have some really good ones coming in. One is by Eva Huang. She's asking, what sort of premium programs are you thinking of adding to your platform? How will you continue to ensure equal access for students?
Sure. So two great questions. I think the first one is we want to add a lot more structure. I think because we're a 24/7, the whole point of being a mobile friendly website is students can access all the information whenever they want. And we've seen usage from as early as 4 or 5 a.m. and as late as 2 or 3 a.m. So it really is the benefit of having everything online. Students can access information when the time is right. But I think there's a limit to how much self-motivation or self-structure people can have. And so we're actually going to be investing in more structured content. So we already have, and if you think about a lot of the content that we want for students, but how do you turn it into, say, an 8-week boot camp, where there's a very clear start, and everyone is kind of on the same page, and you can run that boot camp multiple times a year. And again, we have the information, we have the content, but it's about making it a way that's a bit more structured. So it's not as daunting for a student. You kind of want to come up with a roadmap for them. Sorry?
I was saying that accountability helps us all, especially when we are, working from our bedrooms, right? It's good to have peers in your cohort.
And also to know that, you're going through it at the same time. I mean, if all of us reflect on when we were applying to college, for example, part of the excitement and part of what it made it easier was that all our friends were applying. Well, many of our friends would have been applying at the same time. And so it's about capturing that right time when people are going through the same journey as you. And so that's what we want to kind of instill. And it's especially important because people are not in school together. So students feel even more disjointed from what they're going through. So I think the way we're going to go with premium is going to be mostly around structuring rather than creating a ton of additional content.
I think that's huge. And how about the equal access part?
Sure. So I think, you know, this one's very important. One of the conundrums we face in education is we've realized that because we've given everything away for free, we think sometimes it's people will not necessarily value service as much because it's free. And that so what we're going to be moving towards is actually pricing all the features and all the content that we have, but then to make sure there's equal access for students from lower income backgrounds, basically find a way to give it to them for free.
Mhm.
And there's different ways you can do that, right? Like you could make it free for anyone who goes to public high school. Every student has a unique learner number given to them by government. And so we can check against the government database. And if you go to public high school, we can just give you free access. But if you go to private high school, you know, you're from a higher income family, you can probably afford it.
Mm.
So there's different things you can do around that. But yeah, we're very much a platform for the many, not the few. And so we don't have any intention of leaving millions of students behind when we spent 6 years trying to like get them on the platform to begin with.
Yeah, yeah, and some of the partnerships with corporates. That's an interesting space for you to be examining as well. How do you make it accessible from the cost perspective, from the
Yes.
connectivity perspective, and all of those? Yeah. So another question: how do you recruit teachers and staff, and the counselors, the guidance people that you were talking about, mental health?
Sure. So we mostly do it through partnerships. We don't actually have our own teachers on payroll. What we do is for specific content, we'll look for experts and we'll basically hire them for that topic and we'll create content because most of our content is asynchronous. I hope I'm using the word correctly. It's not live content, so it's pre-recorded. And then for the guidance counselors, it's a government regulated industry, and so we've been working with the main association for years now, and we've actually co-designed programs with them, and so we source our guidance counselors from there. But we don't, and typically these are guidance counselors who already work in schools, so they
Yeah,
can't work for Edukasyon full time. So it's more about having a pool of resources and making them available to students.
got it. Okay. And so do you have that kind of service where you do match students with counselors in person, or is it mainly all content that you pre-record now?
So for now, it's been mostly content, but it's actually one of the things that we're launching over the next couple of months. It's to be able to set up access directly to guidance counselors.
Mm,
Um, and we think that's also something we can justify premium pricing
yeah,
because no one will expect a one-on-one session for free,
yeah,
or at least they shouldn't.
for sure. All right. So I want to circle back to some of the more personal questions. One of them from Zihan Zhang. What are some of the challenges and most rewarding moments in founding Edukasyon?
How much time do you have?
You have a lot
So
of time.
yeah,
Pocket.
yeah, yeah. No, so I think the most challenging, I mean, there's a lot of different challenges. I think one is it's quite hard coming into this industry. It's very humbling to come in as a non-educator, and especially, my background, as I mentioned, was in finance. What do I know about education? The honest answer is nothing. I mean, I've gone through high school and college, congrats, but when it comes to methodology, when it comes to all the theory of change, when it comes to understanding how the ecosystem works in the Philippines, um, I still am learning every day how the system works, and I think it's very humbling, at times frustrating, and it's definitely challenging. But I still think for education to reform, for there to be education reform in any market, you will need people who do not have an education background to come in. I think that's when you'll start getting really interesting innovations. When you have education experts and non-experts working together, then that's how you can have breakthrough models. But I would say that's one big challenge. I think the second big challenge is education is an experiential good. So, your users are both your clients and the product. And so it's a very emotional decision, and it can be an emotional outcome. Um, and so I think it's a difficult product basically to work around. Um, and then I would say that the third one is that, altitudes are quite traditional. people are used to paying for tuition. So parents will pay for tuition. They're used to that. They're to a lesser extent used to paying for tutors. Um, Anything that's much newer is not necessarily something that they're that familiar with. And it's a COVID has changed that, by the way. The appetite for innovation has shot through the roof. I mean, we were trying to push online ed 2 years ago. No one was interested. We were running campaigns, we were doing partnerships with Amazon, just no one cared in the Philippines. Not the students, not the parents, not the schools that we were working with. And so there has been silver linings to COVID. I think, the rewarding elements, I think one is hearing from students who've improved their lot through Edukasyon. And the beauty is because we're starting from such a low base in terms of how informed people are and how much guidance they get. Sometimes something as simple as spending 10 minutes on the website and better understanding how to pick a senior high school track, students will leave notes and say, thank you so much. This has like dramatically changed my choice. I'm much more confident about what I have to do now. And I think to know that you can have impact in 10, 15 minutes is something very rewarding. Obviously, you'll need more than 15 minutes to have very meaningful and deep impact on a student. But I think the stories of impact that we get on an anecdotal basis and on an overall number basis are probably what keeps the team, myself included, motivated. It's knowing that we can help millions of students. It's very, very motivating.
Yeah, and it seems like you're only getting started on that journey, really, right? You have this big user base, you can build additional content, additional services on top of that. And I appreciate what you said about it being humbling to go into the education sector without educational experience, and how, getting the trust of educational professionals is actually one of the biggest steps. I used to work in the Department of Education for a bit in Singapore as well. And really the first 6 to 12 months was, I need to learn everything, teach me, right? And then we can innovate together. Like they don't want you to come in and pretend that you know anything too quickly. Yeah. I'm really glad you're working on this. And I just want to give some time to talk about, if things go really, really right for you, for your organization, if they go really right, where would you be in 5 years? What are your dreams for this team?
Sure. So I think, 5 years is a long, long time away. And so we tend to think of it more in a 2 to 3 year horizon. But for us, success will be when every student in the Philippines has internet access, which we think is actually a matter of years, not decades. So that's something we're excited about. And so every student will have internet access and will use Edukasyon on a daily basis. For us, success would be Edukasyon as your daily education coach that just helps you, through the day, through the week, through the month, through the year, and kind of guides you through that funnel so that you jump through all the hoops from high school to senior high, from senior high to some kind of tertiary education. Could be college, could be an online course, could be TechVoc, whatever is the right thing for you, and then holds your hand until your first job.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can basically become that app that gets used on a daily basis by all the students, I think done right, you could end up with a situation of reversing the funnel. And suddenly it wouldn't be 10, 20% who make it through, it would be 10, 20% who don't make it through. I think if we can flip the funnel over the next few years, that for us would be success. That would be, that's the success that we're going for.
What advice do you have for the governments, actually? Because governments plan on jobs, right? And governments also decide on number of higher education places, right? When I was working in that space, we would look at, okay, what are the industry trends? What percentage of like slots do we dedicate to this faculty and that faculty? And there's some planning involved there, very inaccurate. How would you advise though, with the rate that things are changing and the way that students are making decisions, how should governments be planning?
So I would, and this is maybe a bit controversial, but I think actually it's not that controversial because I think Indonesia has shown the way for some of it. If the aim is to get your youth trained, right? The education is always the stepping stone to a fulfilling life. So if your goal is for your entire youth to get the right training that basically prepares them for the job market, there's already a lot of unfilled jobs in the Philippines. So if the government, I mean, no one's asking the government to create more jobs. I mean, they could work on it, and that's the job of like different ministries. But if you look at it from the education perspective, you know, the three things that the government can do, and I think in some ways the Philippine Education Department has been making a lot of progress in many of these areas. So they've actually done quite well in many of these. But one is ensure that you give funding on a student basis. And so, for example, for senior high school, they have a grade voucher program where you can go to public senior high school, but you can also go to a private one. And the government just gives you a voucher. And so if a school charges as much as the voucher, then you go to private high school for free. And so I think that kind of system is very good because it basically brings a lot of competition. And there's a lot of private players that now can basically access subsidies for students. They've done this at the high school level. I think they should also do this at the college level, rather than investing too much in public universities. The Philippines has an oversupply of higher education. I think we have 3 or 4 times as many universities per students than the US, and we're a tenth as rich. You don't need this much supply of physical colleges. So I think one is to have a voucher system. I think 2 is to be stricter in the regulation of what constitutes a quality education.
Yeah.
I think they've done a good job in closing down high schools that were not compliant or that weren't even accredited. There's still a lot of higher education institutions that are just not good quality, and the government should basically just be stricter about closing those, because it's really dangerous when you allow students to get trained by these institutions because they graduate thinking they have a degree, but actually they learn nothing. And so I think that's an area where the government should be stricter. And I would say that the third would be make sure that any subsidy you give applies to all the new forms of training. Because if you're going to give a voucher for someone to study a 4-year psychology course in college, I mean, if they want to use the equivalent voucher to study coding, they should. In fact, they probably need a smaller voucher, and they'll be more employable. So I think it's about putting the choice in the hands of students and their parents, whilst doing your job as a regulator to make sure that the options offered in the Philippines are high quality.
For sure. I think that, you mentioned right at the start about this culture of chasing degrees, when degrees don't necessarily lead to jobs. But then if you cut the degrees down, right, like you get a big public backlash. So how do you, I suppose what you're saying is we need to give them just more choices and subsidize it equally, right? And level the incentive playing field there while working on the mindsets, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Because look, you're right. Like if all Filipino parents want their kids to go to college, it's not going to serve anyone to start saying like college is dead, long live the coding bootcamp. Because first of all, the country needs a lot more than just coders, and second of all, that you cannot change mentalities overnight. And in fact, funny anecdote, we've seen schools in the Philippines that try to say, oh, we will give you such a good high school education that your kid will not need to go to college. And it was actually like a big branding issue because parents were saying like, what's wrong with your school? Why wouldn't my child go to college after? And so they had to backtrack and say, no, but we actually prepare your child for college as well. So it is important to respect current mentalities as well. If you want to engage with students and their parents, you have to talk to them in a language that they can relate to immediately.
Yeah, totally. For us in Singapore, I worked on 2-year degree programs where you go from vocational education and then you get a degree in 2 years, right? And that it's a degree. It's a different type of degree, but it's still a degree, and that matters. And so you cannot get too far away from some of the language that because we talk about generational influence being very strong in Asian culture, right?
Yes.
Can't get away too much from All right. There's one more question. You're going to answer it later, Henry, in the chat, because we only have 3 minutes. I want to close off by giving you a chance to tell the audience and the audience later who's watching your recording, what kind of support are you looking for in this next phase of your journey as you aim to flip the funnel?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I think as always, we always think about the ecosystem that we're trying to build. And so typically at Edukasyon, we look for three things. I think one is, any high quality content or input that could be relevant to students in the Philippines. We're always very hungry for. And so we've seen everything from guest speakers to partnerships with edtech providers to just best practice sharing. So we're always hungry for content and best practices that can be relevant to our users. The second thing is, we are expanding, and so for I think it's a bit more relevant to anyone in the audience who has links either in the Philippines or with the Filipino American community. We're always looking for talent to join the organization, whether in a full-time or advisory capacity. And the third thing that we're doing is we are fundraising. We are planning on doing another round. We've done 3 rounds in the last 5 years, and we'll be doing a fourth fundraising round in the fall. And so we're already talking to a couple of investors, and the thesis remains the same. It's a Philippines-focused investment, and it's to, as you mentioned earlier, how do you build more business verticals on this existing community and user base, whilst ensuring that there's access to for all. And so we have a couple of exciting premium products, and we'll basically be using the fundraising as R&D to develop those and launch them for our users.
That's so exciting, Henry. And 1 minute, any last thoughts for our audience before we close off?
No, I mean, feel free to check out the site. We're always looking for feedback on how to improve it, and so you can email me for any thoughts, questions or feedback. I'll type my email address, and always very interested in. Well, my Zoom is blocked, but I will figure out a way of typing my email address later on in the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Henry. Wonderful talking to you.
Thanks so much, Karen. And
Thank
pleasure.
you, Henry and Karen, for taking us to the Philippines and to Singapore. Your conversation about mental health in particular ties nicely into our final 2 sessions today.